Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Dordel.
And I am Xiong.
It's nice to see you. We are both members of the Student Life and Career Design team, where we work with students every day on coaching them around interview strategies as well as teaching the BA 2021 Design Your Career class. My works extensively with all of our students in developing their interview skill sets, but particularly has a strong talent for working with international students. So we want to give you a brief introduction to some of our coaching strategies and get Mai's insight to help you feel more confident the next time you're going into a conversation with an employer. So Mai, one of the biggest questions that we get asked is kind of how to take ownership of the conversation. How do you introduce yourself? What are the relevant things that employers want to hear about? And so two of the strategies that we coach are kind of positioning statements and elevator pitches. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what the goal of your introduction is when you're talking to an employer?
Yeah, so the goal of when you're talking to an employer is really introducing yourself and telling a little bit more about yourself. Part of that is making sure that you provide your name, your major, what you're looking for, and then prompting them with a question so that you get that conversation started with the employer.
Yeah, essentially one of the most natural ways that you can go about introducing yourself is stating the objective of the conversation. People are interested to know what is the goal of the time that we have together, and also ensuring that you're ending that introduction with a question so that there's a natural opportunity for the employer to start engaging in dialogue with you. So up on the screen, you'll see our present, past, future model, which was one of the most natural ways to kind of replicate this conversation. We also really encourage you to think about small talk. You don't naturally walk up to someone and just start talking business. You often provide a conversation starter that we call small talk. So can you tell us a little bit about what small talk is?
Yeah, so here in Minnesota, we love to talk about the weather. So that's a topic that would be very appropriate to do small talking, asking, hey, how is the weather? What did you think about the weather today? If it's snowing, it's snowing a lot outside. And then just kind of talking a little bit about that. Or you can also talk about sports, and that's something that is a common topic that we talk about. Or just asking them how their day is going, or just like little things that as you kind of notice maybe something they're wearing that you think is beautiful, you can mention that as well too, and that usually gets the conversation started.
Great, a really great tip for being a little bit more natural. So again, you'll see on the screen, we've provided an example of what that might look like in real life as a sophomore student, kind of walking through the present, past, and future model. Please take a moment to kind of review that and think about what key things would you want to highlight in that first 30 seconds of talking to an employer. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common interview questions that you may come across. Again, our goal is to help you feel prepared and confident, but making sure you don't feel overly practiced, overly stiff. We want you to be prepared, but we also want you to be authentic and natural. Mike, can you give me some examples of how you coach people to feel prepared, but also be authentic and natural as they're talking about their interests?
Yeah, I think part of that is making sure that you know what type of questions might be asked during the interview. So a lot of times, if you see on the screen here, we do have some different types of interview questions that typically are asked during interviews. So you want to prepare to answer these type of questions. So general interview questions, behavior interview questions, negative-based interview questions. If you are in consulting or investment banking, those case interview questions and those technical interviews, you want to be familiar with that. So really, it's the time that you spend ahead of time that you're really preparing to answer these questions that's really going to help you during the interview process.
And our coaching team is always here to help you recognize what might be some industry trends within the space that you're interviewing so you can be as prepared as possible. So thinking about general interview questions, these are some of those basic things that we know employers often want to learn about people. We're thinking about spending 40 hours a week working with individuals. We're trying to get a sense of what is your brand? Like, what do you think are your strengths? Any advice that you have for students as they prep for general interview questions?
I mean, these ones are like those, there's no right or wrong answer for these type of questions. You want to just make sure that you can speak about yourself and through the responses to those questions, and because a lot of times it's quite general, and that's why they're called general interview questions. They're quite general, so you want to make sure that you have some specific examples that you can provide for that. Or part of that is also making sure that you have read the position description, and then you are tailoring some of your responses to that particular job description, and really telling them about, hey, this is why I'm interested in this particular position.
Usually when we're preparing students for thinking about general interview questions, we want them to think about what are the 3 key takeaways that you want that interview to remember about you. So the next type of interview question that we see a lot of are behavioral interview questions. And so these are really our traditional storytelling interview questions. Essentially, the premise for behavioral interview questions is past experience is an indicator of future success. So really, behavioral interviews are those key storytelling skill sets. So can you give me an example of what a behavioral interview question might sound like?
Yeah, so you might see that a lot of times behavior interviews question might start with like describe a time or can you share with me a time when you did this. So you're sharing something. They're asking you to share something. So like describe a time when you led a team. So a question like that will be a behavioral interview question. And I would say like these type of questions are probably some of the questions where students spend the most time preparing for. It may be some of the more stress-inducing for many students, but it's also those questions that really tell that story about what your strengths are, what your experiences are, and that's how you really is able to show that you'll be a really good candidate for that particular position.
And the acronym that we teach to help support students have the strongest storytelling possible is called the STAR technique. That's simply an acronym that tells the key parts of a strong story that's as convincing as possible to the employer. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. And all of these are really key strong components to having a great interview response. So, how can you make sure that you're thinking about preparing your stories without sounding too rehearsed or falling into the trap of trying to Google every interview question that you might be asked? Can you tell us a little bit about what a story bank is?
Yeah, so a story bank is basically a document that you want to make sure you prepare ahead of time. So it is a document that has all the different stories that you want to share about the different skills and experiences you've had. One way that would be helpful is really looking at your resume and identifying the experiences you've had and really looking at, for each of these experiences, what stories can I tell about the skills and successes that I've had that I would tell and through an answer for a question. So you want to actually spend some time doing this ahead of time before the interview. And really sitting down and going through the STAR technique and writing responses for each of the 4 components of the STAR technique to really help you kind of remember that story. But obviously, when you're doing the interview, if you're practicing too, you want to make sure that it sounds natural and not robotic, that you're reading a response. So you want to make sure that that helps you practice, but also helps you remember the story that you're going to tell. And any of these stories could be appropriate for different questions, and it really depends on the skill that you're highlighting in that particular story.
Great. Well, let's take a deeper dive and kind of look at a couple of examples. So we've mentioned that STAR stands for situation, task, action, result, and so you'll see a fully written example here on the screen. Situation is really providing the setting for the story. Your interviewer did not sit in that class with you. They're not in that student organization with you. Really set the scene. What's the environment in which your example is taking place? The task is really the action, the problem. Any good story has a problem that needs to be solved or a conclusion that we need to arrive to. So really thinking about what problem am I addressing, what's being solved in this narrative. The second piece is the action. It's really important for you to communicate what role did you play in solving the problem or the task that was set in front of you. And finally, what was the result? Employers are very results driven. They want to know, how did the story end? How did you know it was successful? How do you quantify or qualify that? So again, in this example, we're highlighting problem solving and communication. We're going to show another example as well, and I'll have Mai talk a little bit about what this might look like. And again, we see the color coded for the sections of the STAR technique in the response to this answer.
Yeah, so one thing that I always like to tell students when I'm working with them as it relates to the behavior interview response is that sometimes when you write out a response, it might seem very long. And so when you're actually practicing it, you may want to condense it a little bit so that you're not sounding like you're reading a script. So from our examples that we have here, like the first example that we have is quite long. So if you read it, you might notice that this is a very long example. But this one that we have here is, I would say, more appropriate for if you were responding in a setting that you're actually telling a story to the recruiter. And for this particular one, it's quite short and it gets to the point. And really what we're wanting to make sure that we cover in this is that action step. That action step and the results step are the 2 that are the most important pieces in the STAR technique, because you really want to highlight your skills and you want to highlight how that is relevant to the particular position that you're interviewing for. And so the situation, the task, those are just really setting up the story, but it's really the action section that is going to make the biggest impact.
And our biggest piece of advice is the more that you practice, the stronger that you will be in terms of coming off as natural. Company research, incredibly important. You want to set yourself apart in understanding the organization that you want to work for. So we have a couple of examples here of what you can look at on websites to really have an answer that stands out in terms of understanding what the company does and what they stand for. A couple of additional notes on interviewing that we know are important to students. Dress is often a question we get a lot. How many times has a student shown you a photo and asked if that was an okay?
Every time, every time.
So again, you can work with a coach to understand what might be industry standards, but most important, we want you to be comfortable and confident. If you're interviewing in person, there's some additional items that you might consider bringing with you in person. We've listed those here. Common courtesy, sending that follow-up thank you on LinkedIn or over email is incredibly important. We also have in our communication guide some examples of how to set yourself up for a strong thank you. And again, practice makes perfect. Work with our team to continue to practice, not just writing strong star stories, but becoming as natural as possible. And again, interviewing.com is another resource that's available to you to continue to practice, to work towards the confidence that you know that you'll want to have as you're walking into that conversation with your employer. Something else that's really important to show that you're really engaged and really committed and interested in the role is coming up with questions for your interviewer. Students don't think about that or don't realize how important that is, right?
And that is a really important step to do too, because you want to make sure that you go prepared. So you want to show the employer that, hey, I care about this role and I want this position, and so I want to know more. I'm curious to know more about it. And part of that is really making sure that you go prepared with a few different questions, and actually doing a little bit of research on what do I want to know more about? And maybe you might already have those answers through from the interview and answering those questions, or even from Google. So if you are stuck on trying to figure out what questions can I ask, you can ask questions to the employers, what do you like about working here? Those type of questions are also very valid, and it also shows that interpersonal connection that you're trying to make with the employer.
Employers want to give jobs to people that are excited about getting those opportunities. So kind of as a final wrap-up, we know this is a very basic introduction to interview. We work with students a lot to kind of build their confidence in this space. So if you're interested in looking at some of the resources we've mentioned, those are listed here, as well as you're welcome to work with any of our peer career coaches or our full-time career coaches to really build those foundational skill sets to bring your best self to your interview. Thanks again for our conversation, Mai.
Yeah.